This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 597, entitled The Growing Biconscious Community of Both Sexes. Description. Now that there are probably over 1 million MGTOWs and masculists in the world, a growing number of female masculists are starting to emerge from the woodwork on the internet, preaching MGTOW and masculist ideas to women. This makes it possible for biconscious masculists to combine forces with biconscious feminists to push for the menfairing of the gender laws, thus making men more likely to want to be fathers again. Now the flyer itself. The Growing Biconscious Community of Both Sexes by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. If one is biconscious, by definition, one has had both one's feminist and one's masculist consciousness raised. That is, one is aware that gender oppression is a two-way street, that men oppress women and that women oppress men. Second-wave feminism has been with us for 6 decades, so millions of people are monoconscious. That is, they are familiar with feminist ideas and the idea that men oppress women, which is largely what feminism preaches to society. Over the past decade, the MGTOW and masculist movements have arisen, which present the evidence that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men too, and in fact worse than men oppress women, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, which makes them a lot more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. The worst big 3 ways that women oppress men are women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering, which are horrific gender crimes against men that cause masculists to have a hatred of women who commit these horrible gender crimes against men, who are severely punished by men, masculisted men, who in time will be most men as masculist and MGTOW ideas spread across the planet. Masculists punish gender criminal women by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to die a slow, miserable death, rotting on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at for their gender criminality. There are now probably over 1 million MGTOWs and masculists, thanks to the efforts of hundreds of MGTOW and masculist content providers on the internet who make videos on MGTOW and masculist themes and upload them to the internet, where the whole world can watch them, in brackets, in countries that do not have censorship of their internets. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades. Masculists argue that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women the pill so that they could decide how many kids they wanted, which nowadays is typically 0, 1 or 2. Men gave women science-based medicine, so women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women household gadgets, so women now have time on their hands once their second kid is off to kindergarten or school. So over the past half-century, millions of women have poured into the workforce. Masculists argue that since women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, they have a career window of half a century, even if they stay at home looking after small children for some years. So masculists now stand up and point the finger at women, saying to them, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is manslavery, and in a masculisted world, manslavery will get you killed. Masculists have a hatred of manslavery, since to masculists, manslavery is slavery and hence hated and a war issue." Masculists are at war against fluffies. That is a masculist label for a traditional woman who does not FIP up. FIP equals financially independent person, close brackets, who does not bother to get a career competent education at high school and college, so ends up a fluffy as an adult, and hence expects to be able to parasite off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life. Masculists aim to wipe fluffies off the face of the earth, seeing them as man-slaving, divorce-raping, vermin parasites who are punished to death in the sense of not getting a man. As most men become masculistic and learn to hate fluffies, the way the abolitionists in the US in the 1800s hated slavers of Negroes, fluffies will be wiped out, spat on, rejected by men, masculisted men, both socially and sexually, left to rot on the shelf, and pariahed. Masculist and MGTOW ideas have now reached the minds of millions of men, to the point that women are starting to notice that the men they interact with are now behaving differently compared to traditional men who were raised to be man-slaves, to work for women for decades of men's lives. Masculists teach men that the traditional role of the man, to be a man-slave to a fluffy, is no longer needed, thanks to the march of technology. As stated above, women now have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century, so masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up. For example, for upper middle class women, that they should make the effort to study STEM majors and the professions, and not the fluffy crap majors that the manosphere estimates that about 80% of young women study in today's world. Young MGTOWed and masculisted men increasingly judge potential girlfriends with a very cold, masculist eye, asking themselves, quote, "Is this woman a fluffy? How FIP is she? Does she expect me to be her man-slave, working for her for decades, and then take me to the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court system and have me butchered, losing custody of my kids with a 90% probability, losing my house, forced to pay for my kids whom I will barely be allowed to see, losing half my wealth and stuff to my ex-wife, and if she's a real fluffy, forced to pay her alimony for the rest of my life? Fuck that. If she's a fluffy, I want nothing to do with her. I hate fluffies. They are immoral, man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin to me that I spit at, utterly rejecting them, treating them as a pest to be wiped from the face of the earth, applying such moral pressure on them that they either FIP up or they die a slow, miserable death." End quote. This abolitionist, anti-man-slavery message of the masculists and MGTOWs is really getting out into the world now, influencing the minds of millions of young men who now, in many Western countries, have decided not to marry, not to have kids, since they absolutely reject the idea of facing a 1 chance in 4 of being butchered by the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court system. As a result, millions of young women are increasingly noticing with boyfriend after boyfriend that he refuses to give her his sperm, so that she is forced into babylessness, at least with the quality masculisted men who refuse to give her his sperm. Young women are increasingly panicking about this, so are motivated to understand why these boyfriends are rejecting marriage and paternity on such a mass scale. There are now so many MGTOW and masculist content providers on the internet that we are now seeing the growth of a new phenomenon, that is the female masculist, who preaches masculist and MGTOW ideas to women, explaining to women why men are increasingly rejecting them, even spitting in women's faces. Masculists argue that it is in fact in women's self-interest to become biconscious, since that will make such women more competitive in obtaining the interest of a quality man than can a monoconscious feminist, who masculists see as monoconscious feminazi bigots, that's MFBs. arch-hypocrites, since masculists see women oppressing men far worse than vice versa, pointing out to them how horrific are the big three gender crimes that women commit against men that make them so hated by masculists who punish them to death. A monoconscious feminist, by definition, knows nothing about masculist nor MGTOW ideas, so has been brainwashed by the profoundly misandrous doctrine of feminism that gender oppression is a one-way street, that women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors, causing women, that is monoconscious feminists, to hate men for men's gender crimes against women. Masculists, biconscious masculists, don't deny that men oppress women, brackets, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, etc., but deny vigorously, hatefully, that gender oppression is a one-way street, which to masculists is clearly not the case. So masculists have a hatred of monoconscious feminists, seeing them as arch-hypocrites, since masculists see monoconscious feminists lashing out at men for the ways that men oppress women, whereas in reality, women oppress men far worse. Masculists lash out with hatred at monoconscious feminists, claiming that feminism teaches women nothing about how women oppress men. So the net effect of feminism is to generate misandry in women, which makes them less attractive to men. So millions of monoconscious feminists are seen as repulsive by men who ignore such women, resulting in millions of monoconscious feminists to live alone in middle age, with no man and no kids, being utterly miserable and often on antidepressant drugs. A biconscious feminist, on the other hand, is much nicer to be with for a man. So not surprisingly, biconscious masculists hugely prefer to have relationships with biconscious feminists, since a biconscious feminist loses her monoconscious feminazi bitchiness, being aware that in reality women gender oppress men far worse. This idea that biconsciousness in women is very much in women's self-interest is really starting to penetrate the female mind, especially now that there are so many MGTOWs and masculists telling their girlfriends about MGTOW and masculist ideas. Increasingly now, biconscious masculists are dumping their feminist girlfriends who stubbornly refuse to accept that their feminist monoconsciousness is seen as bigoted hypocrisy to biconscious masculists. This is now starting to happen on a large enough scale that there's real interest on the part of women to know more about what the masculists and MGTOWs are talking about, so that they are more likely to hold on to their boyfriends, since most women know that it's virtually impossible to be both a full-time careerist and to stay at home with very small children at the same time. So they really want to have a man to help pay for her to raise kids. So they are now really waking up to masculist and MGTOW ideas. Once this has happened to a large extent, the next obvious step is for biconscious masculists and biconscious feminists to join forces and vote together for the menfairing of the gender laws, so that men are more prepared to be fathers again. This will lead to the establishment of GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consist half of male masculists and half of female feminists, who then treat the gender issues of both sexes equally. As millions of men become aggressively, hatefully hostile to monoconscious feminism, it will die out within a few years, be replaced by biconscious feminism, which will then allow the menfairing of the gender laws, and women will be able to have babies again. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 590 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.